mus- muscles, the muscular system. We already covered, mostly in the lab, various tissues, including three types of muscle tissues: the skeletal muscle, the smooth muscle, and the cardiac or heart muscle. Um, Going back to the basics, the most important things about the functioning of the body are processing of energy. In order to process the energy, body has to import and move around and manipulate molecules, which means material. Um, and what is this energy going to be used for? Apart from processing molecules, it's used for moving all sorts of things, for moving things inside of our bodies, and for moving our whole bodies. And when we come to movement, muscular tissue is the key. Yes, some things can move because of the force of gravity or inertia, and some things are going to be moved by cells that contain cilia and flagellum. But most of the movement inside of our bodies and most of the movement of our bodies as a whole is performed by the muscles. Movement of the whole body is, or parts of the body, is due to the contraction of skeletal muscles. So we walk and run and swim and jump and lift things by using skeletal muscles. Um, there are things in our body that are also moving. So, for instance, our pupils open and close, or urine gets moved from the kidneys to the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. The food gets moved through the GI tract. This is mostly done by the smooth muscles. And then blood is moved around the body, which carries all sorts of other things to various places in the body, and that is mostly performed by the heart muscle. So these three types of muscles are responsible for most of the movement of the body and inside of the body. Muscles are also allowing us to maintain posture. So we have the skeleton that gives us the our shape and size and allows us to be upright, but it won't be able to do it on its own without muscles supporting it. So the skeletal muscles contain um, are maintaining tone and allows us to stand up. This is Freddy. This class mascot Freddy is going to say hi now to everybody. Okay. Uh, uh, Skeletal muscles also move the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, allowing the thoracic cage to expand and shrink, which allows us to breathe. Uh, Skeletal muscles use a lot of energy, and as we already mentioned, how does that energy come in? In the shape of molecules of glucose, which is then broken down inside of mitochondria to produce ATP. And in that process, because it's imperfect, some of that energy, instead of being bound into ATP, is released as heat. So skeletal muscles, uh, even when they're standing still, but definitely when they're contracting, are giving heat as a byproduct, and that is controlling our core body temperature, our body heat. And finally, muscles are used in communication. So we are speaking and talking, writing, and typing, and gesturing, making facial expressions using muscles. So muscles have quite a lot of uh, uh, roles in the body, but they are always concerned with movement, with using the energy in order to move something from one place to another. Uh, Muscles tissues are specialized tissues. Remember when we were doing histology, there are all sorts of different epithelia, all sorts of different connective tissues, and then we had the nervous tissues and muscular tissues as highly specialized tissues. So, as is highly specialized tissues, muscular muscle cells, muscular tissues have some special properties that other tissues don't have. So, first of those is contractility. So muscle can use energy to shorten itself. And since the ends are going to be attached to something else, like to the two bones or a bone in another muscle or bone and skin or something like that, shortening of that muscle, the contraction, is going to bring those two structures closer, which is movement. So, for instance, biceps contracts, and it is going to flex my forearm. Uh, they mostly lengthen passively. When they're not contracting, they relax and they lengthen. So um, that is one property of the muscle, and that is contractility. Another one is excitability. So a muscle can respond to stimulus. For skeletal muscle, the stimulus comes from nerves, always comes from nerves, and is under the control of the central nervous system of the brain. So it's we mostly consciously control the activity of skeletal muscles. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, they contract spontaneously, but they can also receive inputs from the neural signals, either from the either from the central nervous system or from peripheral, from autonomic nervous system, also from hormones. Uh, Smooth muscles can respond to kind of local stretch or kind of locally secreted chemicals inducing them to contract. So skeletal muscle is mostly under the conscious control, while smooth muscle and hard muscle are not under conscious control. They are spontaneously contracting, and they can respond to sort of all sorts of different other stimuli. Altogether, that is a property of excitability. Extensibility means that the muscle can be stretched beyond its normal length. And after that being stretched, it can still contract. So you can make them longer than normal, and they'll still be able to function afterwards. That's extensibility. Of course, you can overdo it and stretch it too much and break it, but in normal movements, it's possible to extend. Extensibility of the muscle means it can extend beyond its normal length and still be able to function properly, to contract properly. And finally, elasticity. Elasticity is the ability of muscles to recoil. So you stretch them and let go, and they recoil. That means they come back to their original length. So contractility, excitability, extensibility, and elasticity are the four major properties of the muscular tissues. Okay, um, muscles are very. Let's talk about skeletal muscle first. Skeletal muscle cells are thin and very, very long. Every skeletal muscle cell or muscle fiber is uh, is as long as the whole muscle itself. So if biceps is this long, every muscle fiber, every cell in that muscle is going from the one end to the other. So very long, very thin muscles, very thin cells. They're organized. They have a bunch of uh, cells are kind of bound together, and they form a fascicle. The fascicle is surrounded by a very thin layer of connective tissue that is called endomysium. Then you have a whole bunch of fascicles kind of wrapped together, and that's called a muscle bundle. That connective tissue that is surrounding a bundle is called perimysium. And finally, a bunch of bundles are making the whole muscle, and the whole muscle is covered with a connective tissue that is called epimysium. So you need to know actually those words. Epimysium covers the whole muscle, perimysium covers a bundle, and endomysium covers fascicles. Covers the individual cells, the individual muscle fibers. Okay, and so those protein fibers from those three different layers of the connective tissue, the three different layers um, of that connective tissue surrounding the muscle cells and the fascicles and the muscle itself. At the very ends of the muscles, they form tendons, and those tendons attach to another muscle or to the bone. Okay. Uh, Muscle fibers or muscle cells are really, really long cells. They're really, really thin and very, very long. Uh, it can be, meters long in a giraffe, but not so much in our bodies. But still, it can be several centimeters long, or 10, 20, 30 centimeters long, and still very, very thin. Because it's so thin and so long, skeletal muscle cell is going to need to have multiple nuclei, dozens of nuclei, sometimes hundreds of nuclei in a single cell. And this is because it's very hard for the nucleus to produce RNAs that are going to produce proteins in one place and then transport it 30 centimeters away through this tiny little cell, and which is full of fibers, contractile fibers. So instead, there's lots of local nuclei doing the same process locally. The heart muscle cells often have two or three nuclei instead of just one, while smooth muscle cells only have one nucleus per cell. Okay. Um, the muscle cell has electrical components and mechanical components. So, mechanical components are those that are actually doing the contraction, and electrical components are those that are taking the stimulus from the outside and turning it into a contraction. So, electrical components include the cell membrane. In cell membrane, in the muscle, the cell membrane is called the sarcolemma, and sarcolemma has a lot of little tubules that go inside into the cell, and those are called T tubules or transverse tubules, and so they go into the cell itself. And then sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a specialized version of the smooth endoplasmatic reticulum in skeletal muscles. And it is the main storage of calcium. Calcium is very important for contraction. We're going to talk about that in a second. So the T tubules are connected to the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, and they can transport ions in order to stimulate the sarcoplasmatic reticulum to release the calcium. Those are called internal stores of calcium in the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. Uh, Mechanical components include various fibers. There's a proteins called myofibrils. Those are bundles of proteins. Those are protein fibers, different kinds that by interacting with each other affect the contraction. So there are two types of so-called myofilaments, in each fibril. Myofilaments or are called thin filaments or myosin, uh, and thick filaments. Myosin are thick filaments, actin are thin filaments. The actin and myosin filaments are arranged so they pass over each other and they connect each other. So actin are thin and myosin are thick filaments. They're made of protein. Attached to them, there are all sorts of other proteins too. Um, there are those filaments are attached to something that is called a Z disc. It's a membrane essentially, a piece of protein and with some lipids and carbohydrates in it, and all the fibrils are attached to it. So you have kind of a solid something to pull against. And the muscle cell is going to have lots and lots and lots of these little compartments from one Z disc, which it has attached uh, actins, to the other Z disc that has attached actin. And then another one, another one, another one, another one. And if you look under the microscope, you see it as striations. You see lots of little lines. Um, so each one of those lines, each one of those spaces between one Z line and another Z line is called a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is a space, a segment of the muscle from one Z disc to another Z disc. To the Z disc, you have attached the actin filaments, the thick ones, the thin ones, and then the myosin filaments are in between them. Okay, so the thin filaments are attached to the Z discs, that's actin, and then the thick filaments are of myosin are in between them. So they're kind of stacked like this, and they're attached to each other with myosin heads. So the little pieces of myosin stick out and attach to the actin. So as long as it's attached, there's no contraction, there's no movement. Um, actin uh, strands have attached to them uh, two other proteins, which are called troponin and tropomyosin. I'm going to get to that very, very soon. Okay, your online version of your textbook has several excellent animations of how all of this goes. I'm not going to ask about I bands and A bands and H zones and M lines and all that stuff. Z is the only one important, and in between them are sarcomeres. Okay, uh, troponin and tropomyosin. Okay. Um, Troponin is attached to actin, and it is when muscle is not doing anything, tropomyosin is covering the place on the actin where myosin would normally attach. So it's covering it; it's hiding the attachment site. So you cannot have a contracture of muscle until the tropomyosin is moved somewhere else to uncover that site. Um, Troponin is uh, is the one that gets activated in order to allow the tropomyosin to move. It is activated by calcium. Okay, so we are going to now go through like one contraction. When nervous system wants to tell us the muscle to contract, it is going to stimulate neurons that are going to end up on the sarcolemma, on the membrane of the muscle. Those neurons use neurotransmitter acetylcholine always. And this kind of synapse between a nerve ending, an axon of a nerve, and the muscle cell is called neuromuscular junction or neuromuscular synapse. And it's always using acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. When that neuron fires, uh, it's at its ends releases acetylcholine on the surface of the muscle membrane. There are receptors for acetylcholine. When acetylcholine binds to those receptors, they open pores in the muscle cell membrane, allowing sodium, which is a positive ion, to surge into the cell. It surges into the cell where? Into the T tubules. Those T tubules are along the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. They're going to stimulate the sarcoplasmatic reticulum to release calcium from the internal stores. Now, calcium is freely moving around cytoplasm and it can attach to what? It can attach to troponin, which is responsive to calcium, which is going to allow the troponin to allow the tropomyosin to remove itself from the myosin binding site. So actin is now kind of like naked in its place where myosin normally is attached, and so the myosin can attach itself there. Okay, so once that happens, uh, the the myosin is activated by calcium, which is surging through that, and so those heads that are connected to the uh, actin are going to bend. The neck is going to bend, and it's going to move the fiber on top of it. It's going to then detach and attach itself to the next binding site. And it's going to move it again and then again and again. So calcium is important to remove the tropomyosin and to activate the myosin heads, so the necks can bend and move the myosin heads all over the actin, thus shortening the muscle. The problem is with the detachment of the head of myosin from the actin is that it requires energy, and that energy comes from ATP, which is why muscles have enormous quantities of mitochondria, and they're very energy expensive tissues because for every muscle contraction, they need to use not just lots of calcium, but also a lot of ATP, a lot of energy. Okay, um, so we are going to assume that there is a difference in voltage between the inside and the outside. We're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to the nervous system. But what a cell has, an excitable cell has, and a muscle cell is an excitable cell, is what is called a resting membrane potential, which means there's a difference in voltage between the inside and outside. Formation of that resting membrane potential requires energy. Again, what brings energy to any process is ATP. There is a pump that exchanges potassium and sodium between the inside and outside of the cell, and that pump is energized by ATP. This exchange of sodium and potassium is what is going to increase the voltage across the membrane, which allows acetylcholine, when it opens the pores, for the sodium to burst into the cell in order to go down its own uh, concentration gradient in order to equalize how much sodium is inside and outside, which then starts the process of stimulating the cell to contract. We're going to talk about action potentials and all of that stuff when we get to the nervous system. It all works at the neuromuscular junction. And again, go to your online version of the textbook and look at all of those wonderful animations that they are made there. Okay. Um, so let's go to kind of the next step. Once the uh, muscle has contracted, it needs to relax. Contraction is over, it needs to relax. How is it going to relax? Uh, well, all that calcium needs to be transported back into the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. And ATP that was used in reactions, and so a phosphate was broken off to make the ADP. It's reconstituted back into ATP and brought back into uh, away from the fibers into the cytoplasm and wherever else it might be stored. Okay, uh, twitch. Okay, the muscle twitch is a response of a muscle fiber to a single action potential of the motor neuron. So I have one action potential, and that's one twitch. That's like one movement of tiny little movement of the muscle, and the twitch has several phases. It's figure 711, which shows you that. Look at that. Uh, what is interesting about muscles is that uh, there are different kinds of contractions. So uh, there are contractions where the muscle stays the same length and yet builds up power. The muscle does not shorten when it contracts. That is called isometric. The same metric, the same meter, right? The same length. So you can have a completely straight arm and then pick up something from the floor and lift it. Your muscles have not shortened, and yet they are working really hard to lift a heavy weight. This increases tension in the muscle, but the length stays the same. On the opposite side are isotonic contraction, where the tension in the muscle may stay the same, but the length of the muscle shortens as it goes. Uh, that would be an isotonic contraction. Um, the motor units in different muscles are different. So remember how muscle cells are making those bundles called fascicles, and those are making the muscle, its whole muscle as a cell is itself. Uh, a motor unit is slightly different division of the cell. It's all the muscle fibers that are innervated by a single motor neuron. So there are muscles, they're kind of crude, right? They're going to have one muscle, one neuron innervating a lot of muscles, making axon kind of processes and neuromuscular junctions of many, many muscle cells. So once that impulse comes in, many muscle cells are contracting at the same time, uh, which is uh, which is called recruitment of motor units. And then other muscles have essentially like one neuron, one muscle, like a fine, in uh, in fingers and around the lips and eyes. Some of those muscles are so finely tuned that it's essentially one neuron innervating one muscle cell. That fine thing. And so, depending on how much force you need, you're going to recruit a few muscle fibers or more or the whole muscle as its own. Okay, so um, we are not going to talk about wave summation and tetanus and all that stuff. This is more like 168 uh, level. Uh, there are concentric and eccentric contractions. So both of those are isotonic contractions. So those are the contractions in which the metrics, the length of the muscle, changes, it shortens. Uh, and so the concentric contractions result uh, in an increased tension as the muscle shortens. So it's it is bringing a starting muscle at a relatively low tension, and as it contracts, it builds up more and more tension. Eccentric are opposite. More they shorten, less strength they need. So, let's say you're lowering a weight. There are different types of muscle fibers. There are several different ones, but we are going to focus on kind of the major division into slow twitch and fast twitch. Uh, they are different in the way they look, in the way their muscle fibers are composed. They may contain slightly different forms of myosin. So, uh, in the slow twitch muscles, muscle fibers contract more slowly, and they're more resistant to fatigue. Fast twitch muscles contract more quickly, but they also fatigue quickly. Uh, so the proportion of muscle fiber types differs. Now, if you eat a chicken, you know there's white meat and dark meat. What do you think that is, right? Uh, and why are they uh, different in color? Slow twitch muscles contain large amounts of myoglobin, and myoglobin is what gives dark meat its dark shade, while fast twitch muscles don't have myoglobin, which is why they're pale. Now, when you look at humans, we really don't have dark meat and white meat. We have uh, each one of our muscles is a mix of different types of muscle fibers, including different types of slow twitch fibers and different types of fast twitch fibers. And so different muscles are going to have different proportions. Muscles that are mostly about posture are going to be mostly slow. Muscles that have to do things fast are going to have mostly fast twitch fibers. But there's always going to be a proportion, and those two types of muscles are going to be distributed differently. Those things can be affected by exercise. The muscle, in response to exercise, can hypertrophy, or if it's not used at all, it can atrophy. Uh, so the number of fibers does not change. How many fibers are in the muscle does not change. So how do you get hypertrophy? Is that each one of the muscle fibers gets thicker and makes more of the actin and myosin fibers inside of them, so you get stronger. Adds new nuclei, so it can process everything faster. It gets more blood vessels coming to it. Uh, each cell gets more mitochondria because there's a greater requirement for energy. So you need more mitochondria to process the more glucose to make more ATP to be able to make a stronger muscle contraction. So those are important results of exercise, that you are not increasing the number of cells, but you're increasing the size, the thickness, and the efficiency of each cell. Okay, so let's have kind of a thought exercise uh, ab- about different types of contractions and different types of muscle fibers. If you're right handed, you are going to use your arms and your legs differently, right? For instance, let's say you pick up a knife and you are going to cut the bread. You're going to hold the bread with the left hand and cut the bread with the right hand, or salami or cheese or whatever you're cutting. So those two arms are going to do different things. And you are right handed because you're having that preference. Which arm is going to do this and which arm is going to do this? What is this? This is isometric. What is this? This is isotonic. What is this? This is slow and it doesn't fatigue much. What is this? This is fast and it's fine to fatigue because it keeps going on over and over and over again. So you can expect that the left side of the body is going to have a greater proportion of slow twitch fibers, while the right side of the body is going to have uh, a greater proportion of the fast twitch fibers. So you can use fast twitch fibers in your fingers, in your arms, in the legs, uh, while the left side is the one that is stable, that's giving you stability for posture. It's holding stuff while this one is manipulating it. That's also why you get on a horse from the left side, because this one is stable and this leg is stable, and right leg flies over the saddle onto the horse. So uh, you have an uh, isometric preference on the left and isotonic preference on the right if you're right handed. If you're left handed, everything goes reverse. Um, there's a whole kind of subchapter here about in your textbook about sources of energy. Yeah, we have ATP. There's creatinine and all that stuff. I'm not going to ask you that into detail. Uh, we can have in hardworking muscles both anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So when we talked about mitochondria breaking down glucose and getting anywhere between 30 and 38 ATPs, that's what we're talking aerobic. Why is it aerobic? Because it requires oxygen, right, which comes from air. All of that gets used up pretty fast if you're really, really active. So, what the muscle does instead is anaerobic respiration. It switches to anaerobic. It just does glycolysis, just does, uh, 2 to 4 ATP molecules at a time. And as a result, you get uh, uh, side products that end up becoming lactic acid. Lactic acid is a result of anaerobic respiration, and despite people thinking that kind of muscle soreness and cramps after strong exercise are not due to lactic acid. Now, lactic acid gets exported to the liver where it can be reconstituted into glucose and reused again. Okay. Um, that um, is about it. Okay, a little bit about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle cells are much smaller, have only one uh, uh, nucleus. They can be stimulated by hormones. They can be stimulated by locally secreted chemicals. They can be stimulated mechanically, let's say by stretch. They usually lining around some kind of tube or hole. If that hole stretches, it's going to activate them to contract. And they can be activated by the autonomous nervous system, the vegetative nervous system. So either acetylcholine or adrenaline or noradrenaline or epinephrine are going to be neurotransmitters. Now they don't have a neuromuscular junction. They have a whole bunch of uh, batons that are on top of the cells that are secreting, let's say, acetylcholine kind of into that space, and that acetylcholine or epinephrine just kind of diffuses to the muscle cells and stimulates them to contract. Smooth muscle cells, if they exercise a lot, will divide and make more of them, so you can increase the number of smooth muscle cells. They are using some of the similar mechanisms, but there are some differences in how they actually do the contraction. It's not as well organized with lots and lots of actins and myosins. It's a little bit more diffuse. And we're going to talk about the heart cell more when we talk about the heart itself and how it electrically all goes. Uh, they have intercalated discs between them. They stimulate each other by direct stimulation from one cell to the next because ions can go through those holes in those gap junctions in intercalated discs, one straight from one cell to the next to the next to the next, making sure that all of the heart contracts at the same time. So it's very, very fast. It doesn't have synapses, it doesn't wait for it. It just goes from one cell to the next with a direct stimulation from one cell to the other. Okay. Um, when it comes to anatomy, we're going to do that mostly in the lab. You already know what a tendon is. That is kind of a tubular connective tissue that connects the muscle to a bone, occasionally a muscle to another muscle, or muscles to the skin, while ligaments are connecting bone to bone. Uh, they usually, when you think about it, at the end of the muscle, they're kind of long and thin, like a rope. But there are also muscles that are thin and broad, and so their tendons are going to be thin and broad, like membranes, and that is now not called a tendon; it's now called an aponeurosis. Okay, so you need to know that for lecture, but mostly we're going to look at those things on in the lab. Uh, the agonists and antagonists and different types uh, of movements. What is flexion? What is extension? Those are kind of things that we are going to cover in the lab and not for the lecture material. Okay. So this is where I'm going to stop about the muscles. Uh, your textbook is excellent, has a little bit too much in some places, but I kind of told you what it is. So this video should be a decent kind of study guide for you for how to go about studying muscles.